The training grounds were always filled with noise, the clash of wooden practice blades, the bark of commanders giving orders, the laughter of those who thought themselves stronger than the rest. Among them stood Arya, her shoulders squared, her grip firm on the training spear, her eyes determined. Yet despite her effort, the whispers followed her like a shadow. They called her combat weak, a liability, someone unfit to wear the armor of the defense corps. She had grown used to the mockery, the sneers, the smirks when her strikes lacked the crushing force of others, but what none of them understood was that she had learned to endure. Every insult became another weight on her back, and every weight was something she carried in silence, building a strength that was not easily seen. The others valued brute power, the raw crash of blows that sent opponents sprawling. Arya's strength was quieter, a patience that stretched beyond taunts, a will that refused to break, and a resolve that burned deeper with every humiliation she endured. That morning the drills had been especially harsh. The commander, a broad man named Darius, made each recruit pair off and demonstrate their progress. When Arya's turn came, she faced Kellen, a hulking soldier with the arms of a blacksmith and the confidence of a man who had never been told no. His grin was cruel as he tapped his practice blade against the dirt. "Don't worry, little bird," he said loud enough for the others to hear. "I won't break you too quickly. I'll let you show the commander your fancy little moves first." Laughter erupted around them, filling the training field with a sting sharper than any blade. Arya's jaw tightened, but she kept her focus, bowing respectfully before raising her spear. The fight began, and as expected, Kellen swung with brute force, each strike a hammer meant to crush. She parried, dodged, her movements swift and precise, but the commander frowned. "Stop dancing, girl," he barked. "Stand and fight, or admit you're not fit for this corps." Her arms trembled under the pressure of Kellen's strikes, but her heart did not waver. She would not admit defeat, not today, not ever. The fight ended only when the commander called it off, shaking his head, the others jeering. "Combat weak," someone muttered again, and the word stuck in the air like a bitter taste. Later that evening, when the drills were done and most had gone to the mess hall, Arya sat alone at the edge of the training ground, her spear lying across her knees. The sky glowed orange with sunset, and the scent of earth mixed with the faint smoke of cooking fires. She thought about her place among them, about why she stayed when every day was a storm of doubt and mockery. It would have been easier to leave, to walk away and find another path where the weight of others' opinions did not crush her spirit. But the truth was, she stayed because she believed in more than herself. She had joined the defense corps not for glory, not to prove her strength, but because she knew the world beyond the walls was dangerous, and someone had to stand ready to protect those who could not fight. Her village had once been raided when she was a child. She remembered the fear, the screams, the helplessness. She had vowed then that she would never be powerless again, and never let others endure what she had endured. That vow was stronger than every insult thrown at her, stronger than the commander's doubt, stronger than the laughter of men like Kellen. That night, fate decided to test that vow. The alarm bells rang out suddenly, a clamor that echoed across the garrison with urgent dread. Soldiers scrambled, some half-dressed, others still clutching bowls of food as the cry spread, "Raiders at the eastern gate." The enemy had slipped through the forests unseen, and now a band of marauders surged toward the walls, their war cries chilling the night. Arya's heart pounded as she grabbed her spear and raced with the others. The eastern gate was a chaos of shouts, torches, and steel. The raiders were fierce, hardened men with blades stained by battles, their numbers greater than anyone had expected. Panic threatened to ripple through the defenders as the first clash rang out. Arya took her place among them, her spear steady in her grip, her breath even. She heard someone curse, "We're outnumbered." Another voice shouted, "Fall back." The commander barked orders, but the line wavered under the onslaught. It was then that Kellen, the same man who had mocked her earlier, faltered. A raider's axe cleaved through his guard, and his weapon was knocked from his hand. He stumbled back, fear etched across his face as the enemy bore down on him. Arya saw it in an instant, the opening, the danger, the chance to prove what words never could. Without hesitation she surged forward, her spear thrust cutting the raider's advance short. The tip struck true, forcing the enemy back and giving Kellen the moment to recover. For a breath, silence filled the gap where mockery once had been, and all eyes turned to her. She did not wait for thanks, did not seek recognition. She simply pressed forward, her movements sharp, efficient, focused. One by one she deflected strikes, redirected blows, standing where others faltered. Every jeer, every insult, every dismissal she had suffered became fuel for her strength. She was no longer the girl mocked for weakness. She was the shield standing between the enemy and her comrades. The night roared on with the chaos of battle, but something shifted among the defenders. They began to rally around her, inspired by her refusal to yield. Where the line had faltered, she held firm, anchoring them in place. She shouted no commands, yet her presence spoke louder than words. Her spear struck, blocked, swept, and each motion carried a determination that spread like fire through the ranks. In that moment, no one called her weak. No one laughed. The battlefield had silenced them all, and only her courage remained for them to follow. The clash at the eastern gate grew fiercer with every passing moment, torches spilling flickering light over faces strained with fear and sweat. The raiders pressed hard, their shouts echoing against the walls, their blades ringing as they struck again and again. Arya's arms ached from the force of her defense, but she did not yield. She planted her feet, her spear an extension of her will, every thrust and parry deliberate. She could feel the weight of the battle pressing down, the ground trembling with the stomp of boots and the crash of bodies, yet her focus remained unbroken. Around her, soldiers who had once laughed at her now fought shoulder to shoulder with renewed determination. Kellen, regaining his weapon, cast her a quick look, one not of mockery but of gratitude laced with disbelief. He had seen it, they all had. The woman they called combat weak was holding the line where stronger men had faltered. The commander's voice boomed from behind, urging them to stand fast, but his words felt hollow compared to Arya's silent defiance at the front. When another raider lunged at her, a massive figure with a scar down his cheek, she spun her spear low, sweeping his legs from under him before driving the butt of her weapon into his chest to knock the breath from his lungs. The maneuver sent murmurs through her comrades, some even rallying cries, and the momentum began to shift. Fear slowly gave way to fire. One soldier shouted, "Hold the gate! Stand with her!" and the cry spread like a wave. For the first time in her years of training, Arya felt the weight of others leaning not against her but alongside her. It was not her commanders nor the jeers of her peers that defined her in that moment, it was the raw truth of survival, and the will to protect those who could not protect themselves. But the raiders were not so easily driven back. Reinforcements poured in through the treeline beyond, their silhouettes emerging against the firelit darkness like shadows come alive. The defenders' courage flickered, uncertainty returning to their eyes as the enemy's numbers swelled. A young recruit beside Arya cried out in panic, his sword slipping from his trembling hands. The raiders advanced, their confidence unshaken, their weapons raised high. Arya saw the boy's terror, the way his body froze, unable to move. She did not think, she acted. She stepped in front of him, blocking the raider's strike with the shaft of her spear, sparks flying as metal ground against wood. With a twist of her wrists, she disarmed the attacker and struck him across the jaw, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The boy gasped in shock, his life spared, and Arya's voice, firm and steady, cut through the chaos. "Pick up your sword," she told him. "Fight for the person next to you, not for yourself." Her words lit something inside him, and he bent to retrieve his blade with newfound resolve. The commander, watching from the rear, could no longer deny what was unfolding before his eyes. He had dismissed her as fragile, unfit for combat, yet here she was, shielding his men, steadying the line. She was not leading with orders, but with unshakable courage. He barked for reinforcements, ordering more archers to the walls, but in his heart he knew the truth. The tide of the battle was being turned by the very one they had mocked. Still, the night pressed on, and the raiders fought with ruthless ferocity. Their leader, a towering brute clad in scavenged armor, forced his way to the front. His voice was harsh and guttural as he roared above the din, calling his warriors to cut down the defenders. His eyes locked on Arya, perhaps recognizing in her the anchor that kept the line from breaking. He charged forward, blade raised, his presence alone sending tremors through the defenders. Arya tightened her grip, her knuckles white, her breath steady. Around her, the others faltered at the sight of the enemy leader's size and fury, but she did not move. She had stood against fear before, in childhood when raiders had stormed her home, and she had sworn never again to let terror rule her. Now the past and present collided in a single instant, and she met the charge head-on. The first blow from his heavy sword rattled down her arms, nearly driving her to her knees, but she held firm. Sparks flew, the sound of impact ringing across the gate. Gasps rose from the defenders, but Arya pushed back, her spear deflecting the next strike, her body weaving to avoid the brute's sweeping blade. It was not brute strength that kept her alive. It was precision, timing, and the fire that refused to die inside her. Each time he struck, she turned it aside, her movements flowing like water around stone. The clash became a duel, the entire battlefield watching as the so-called weak girl stood alone against a giant. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, but she would not falter. The raider leader bellowed, driving his sword downward in a crushing arc, but Arya stepped inside the blow, twisting her spear to hook the blade and wrench it aside. With her other hand, she slammed the butt of her weapon into his knee, forcing him to stumble. A roar erupted from the defenders as they surged forward, emboldened by her stand. The leader snarled, regaining his footing, and swung again, but Arya was ready. She pivoted, the spear tip flashing under torchlight, and struck him across the chest. The force sent him staggering back, armor dented, pride wounded. For the first time, hesitation crossed the faces of the raiders. Their leader, the one they thought invincible, had been driven back by the woman they had mocked as combat weak. The line of defenders erupted with fury, pressing forward as one, no longer cowering but roaring with strength. The battle stretched long into the night, but something fundamental had changed. The defenders were no longer merely holding the gate, they were fighting to protect each other, bound together by Arya's defiance. Where once there was doubt, now there was unity. Where once there was laughter at her expense, now there was silence filled with respect. Each clash of steel rang louder than the insults that had haunted her, each step forward another declaration that weakness was not what defined her. And as the moon climbed higher above the battlefield, Arya stood tall among her comrades, her body weary but her spirit unbroken, the living proof that strength came not from the absence of fear, but from the refusal to bow to it. The night air carried the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smoke of torches as the battle dragged on. The defenders' breaths came ragged, every strike growing heavier with exhaustion, yet they held the line with a ferocity none of them could have imagined hours earlier. Arya stood at the center of it all, her armor dented, her arms trembling from strain, but her spirit blazing as fiercely as the fires along the walls. The raiders, stunned by the resistance, wavered in their assault, their confidence shaken after seeing their leader driven back. Still, desperation gave them courage, and they hurled themselves forward in reckless waves, determined to break through before dawn. The ground beneath the eastern gate became a tangle of bodies and steel, shadows locked in brutal struggle. Arya pushed through it all, her spear lashing out with precision. For every enemy that fell before her, she carried the weight of her comrades' survival on her shoulders. When the commander called for a brief retreat to reorganize the line, Arya stepped back with the others, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Kellen approached, sweat streaking down his face, his once arrogant demeanor humbled. "I owe you my life," he admitted, his voice raw. "I thought you were weak. I was wrong." Arya met his gaze briefly, her expression unreadable, then turned her eyes back to the battlefield. She had no time for praise or apologies, not while danger still pressed at the gates. Yet inside, something stirred, a small spark of vindication, not born from pride, but from knowing that her persistence had finally broken through the walls of doubt others had built around her. Kellen's words were not what fueled her, though. What fueled her was the sight of terrified recruits standing straighter, older soldiers gripping their weapons tighter, each one rallying because she had shown them it could be done. The raiders regrouped, their leader rallying them with guttural shouts that rolled like thunder across the field. He was wounded, his armor cracked from Arya's spear, but his fury burned hotter for it. He pointed toward the defenders, his voice carrying venom. "Break them. Tear them apart." And with that, another charge began. The defenders braced, shields raised, swords ready. Arya took her place at the front again, her spear braced against the earth, her eyes locked forward. The clash was deafening, metal crashing. Against metal, cries of rage and fear blending into a single roar. A raider broke through the line near her left, swinging a heavy axe toward a young soldier. Without hesitation, Arya pivoted, intercepting the blow, her spear snapping upward to drive into the raider's side. The soldier gasped, spared by her intervention, and managed to finish the enemy with trembling hands. Each time the line faltered, Arya was there, shoring it up, becoming the unyielding pillar they leaned upon. But the enemy's numbers pressed relentlessly, and cracks began to form in the defense. The gate itself groaned under the strain as raiders hacked and hammered at it, determined to tear it down. Panic rose once more among the defenders as splinters flew and the wood shuddered dangerously. If the gate fell, the village behind them would be exposed and the fight would turn to slaughter. Arya saw the fear ripple through the ranks, the way eyes darted to the weakening gate as though hope itself were splintering with it. She gritted her teeth, raised her voice for the first time that night, and shouted over the chaos. "Stand with me. Hold, and they will break before we do." Her words carried across the line, cutting through fear, planting seeds of resolve in weary hearts. It was not a commander's polished order, nor a speech crafted for inspiration. It was the raw truth of someone who had bled beside them, who refused to yield even when the world seemed ready to collapse. Her cry lit a fire. The defenders roared back, their voices shaking the night, and they surged forward with renewed vigor. Arya led the charge, spear flashing in arcs of silver under the torchlight. She weaved through the chaos, striking where the enemy pushed hardest, her presence turning the tide again and again. The raiders, frustrated and rattled, began to falter, their confidence crumbling each time she turned aside another strike. But the enemy leader was relentless. With a furious bellow, he forced his way through the clash, his massive frame towering over the defenders. His eyes burned with hatred as he sought her out, pushing aside his own men to reach the woman who had defied him twice. Arya met his gaze and stepped forward without hesitation, the battlefield falling into a strange silence around them, as though both armies knew the duel to come would decide the night. Their blades met with bone-rattling force, his heavy sword crashing against her spear. Each blow tested her strength, threatening to break her, but she flowed around him, turning his power against him. He swung wide, aiming to crush her with sheer force, but she ducked beneath, striking at his side. His armor held, but the impact staggered him. He retaliated with a brutal overhead strike, and she barely managed to deflect it, the shock vibrating up her arms until her teeth clenched. Pain flared in her muscles, fatigue gnawing at her, yet she pressed on, her focus unbroken. Around them, the defenders shouted encouragement, their voices merging into a chorus that fueled her spirit. For every doubt she had endured, for every insult, this was the moment to prove them wrong, not with words, but with action carved into the heart of battle. The fight stretched long, each exchange pushing her closer to exhaustion, but her will did not waver. She remembered the cries of her childhood village, the helplessness she had sworn never to feel again. That memory became her weapon, sharper than steel, stronger than fear. With a sudden burst of speed, she spun inside the raider leader's guard, her spear striking low at his knee. He roared, stumbling, and she seized the opening. Driving forward, she thrust her spear into the gap of his armor at his side. The blow pierced deep, and his roar turned to a gurgle of pain. Silence fell across the battlefield as he collapsed to his knees, his weapon slipping from his grasp. Arya stood over him, chest heaving, her spear steady though her arms trembled. She had done what none of them had thought possible. She had brought down the beast that threatened them all. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, like a storm breaking, the defenders erupted into a roar of triumph. The raiders, seeing their leader fall, wavered, their ranks faltering in disarray. Some fled back toward the treeline, others fought with desperation, but the tide had turned. The defenders pressed forward, emboldened by their champion, and the enemy line broke apart. Arya remained where she stood, her breath ragged, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her spirit burning brighter than ever. She had not fought for glory nor for recognition. She had fought because she had sworn to protect, because she had chosen to stand where others faltered. And now, for the first time, her comrades saw her not as combat weak, but as the shield and spear that had saved them all. The battlefield slowly quieted as the last of the raiders scattered into the darkness, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The defenders stood in stunned silence, their armor bloodied, their faces pale with exhaustion, their breaths ragged in the cold night air. The crackling of torches and the groaning of the battered eastern gate were the only sounds that remained. Among them stood Arya, her spear still gripped tightly in her hands though her arms trembled with fatigue. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the night began to fade, replaced by the heavy ache of muscles pushed to their limit. Around her, eyes turned not with scorn, not with laughter, but with something far heavier, respect, awe, and a quiet gratitude that words could not yet carry. For years they had mocked her as combat weak, a burden among soldiers, but on this night she had been the unbreakable wall that saved them all. The commander, Darius, stepped forward, his face unreadable beneath his helmet's shadow. He had watched everything from the moment she took the front line to the instant she brought the enemy leader to his knees. His pride as a commander warred with the shame of his earlier dismissal of her worth. He stopped before her, his broad frame towering, yet he found himself strangely smaller in her presence. "Arya," he said, his voice gruff but softer than usual, "you held where others would have broken. You defended this gate when even I thought it lost. Tonight you proved every one of us wrong." The silence of the defenders deepened, all listening. Arya met his gaze, her chest still rising and falling with heavy breaths. She gave a simple nod, her voice calm. "I didn't fight to prove anyone wrong. I fought because if this gate fell, the people behind it would have no one left to stand for them. Her words struck deeper than any blade, a reminder of why they existed as defenders in the first place. Darius lowered his head, humbled. Then you've reminded us all of what it means to wear this armor. As the soldiers tended to the wounded and secured the gate, Arya finally allowed herself a moment to sit on a stone by the wall, her spear resting across her knees. Her body throbbed with pain, her shoulders bruised from countless blows, her legs heavy as though made of stone, but her mind was sharp, her spirit steady. Kellen approached her once again, no trace of arrogance left in him. His armor was dented, his face smeared with dirt, but his eyes carried an honesty she had never seen before. I mocked you more than anyone, he admitted, his tone quiet. I thought strength was only in muscle, only in how hard a man could swing a sword. But tonight I saw that strength is standing when everyone else falls. You saved my life and the lives of many here. I will never forget it. For a moment, Arya looked at him, remembering every insult, every smirk, every time his laughter had cut into her resolve. Yet instead of bitterness she felt something unexpected, a sense of release. The fight had burned away the weight of their words. She gave him a faint, weary smile. Then don't waste it. Be the kind of soldier who stands for others, not just for yourself. The night passed slowly into dawn, the eastern horizon painted in soft hues of orange and pink. The defenders gathered the fallen, both friend and foe, and laid them out upon the field. There was no laughter, no jeering, only the quiet ritual of honoring the dead. Arya helped where she could, lifting bodies despite the pain in her arms, her hands steady as she draped cloaks over lifeless forms. She moved among her comrades not as the outcast she had been the day before, but as one of them, bound by blood and fire. When the villagers emerged from their homes beyond the wall, faces filled with fear and worry, they saw the battered defenders standing victorious. Mothers embraced their children, elders wept with relief, and whispers spread quickly of the woman who had stood unyielding at the gate. Arya felt their eyes upon her, but she did not seek their praise. She had not fought for songs or stories. She had fought because she remembered being one of those children once, cowering in fear, and she had sworn never again to let others live that terror. By midday, word of the battle spread beyond the village. Messengers carried tales to neighboring garrisons, and soon what had been whispers among soldiers became stories told with awe. The commanders debated how the raiders had slipped so close, but in every retelling the focus returned to Arya, the woman mocked as combat weak who had stood firm when all else wavered. Some called it luck, others called it courage, but none could deny the truth. Without her the gate would have fallen and the village would have burned. The shift in how others looked at her was palpable. Soldiers who had once turned their backs now sought her out, asking for guidance, training beside her with quiet respect. Even the commander who had once barked at her to stop dancing and fight, now watched her with a new weight in his gaze. She had not only saved the village, she had changed the very way they understood strength. That evening, as the fires burned low and the camp settled into uneasy rest, Arya sat alone once more at the edge of the training grounds. The sky above was vast and filled with stars, silent witnesses to the night that had reshaped her fate. Her body was battered, her spirit weary, but her heart was steady. She thought of the path ahead, of battles yet to come, of the weight she would continue to carry, not of insults but of responsibility. For the first time she felt that she no longer carried it alone. Around her she could hear voices of soldiers sharing food, laughter returning but softened, humbled by the night's events. For the first time when they spoke of her, it was not with scorn but with pride. Arya the steadfast, one said. The shield at the gate, another murmured. She closed her eyes, letting the words drift past. She did not need names nor titles. She only needed to know that when the world demanded someone to stand, she had stood. And she would again, no matter how many times it was asked of her. The days following the battle brought an uneasy calm. The village resumed its rhythm, but the echoes of the raid lingered in every cautious glance and hushed conversation. The defenders rebuilt the eastern gate, replacing shattered beams with fresh timber, their hands moving with urgency as though they feared the raiders might return at any moment. Arya worked beside them, her body still aching but her spirit unshaken. Each swing of a hammer, each stone lifted into place reminded her of why she had fought, because the safety of these people was not abstract, it was real, it was fragile, and it depended on those willing to hold the line. Yet even as the wall rose stronger, whispers persisted, not of her weakness anymore but of her courage. Children followed her when she walked through the village, their wide eyes filled with admiration. Old women pressed food into her hands, calling her a blessing. Soldiers who once mocked her now treated her as their equal, though their respect carried a weight that felt heavier than their earlier scorn. For in their eyes she was no longer just one of them, she was something more, a symbol of what they all aspired to be. But symbols came with burdens. Arya knew it well. Late one evening, as she sharpened her spear under the flicker of torchlight, Commander Darius approached. His expression was serious, his steps deliberate. "Arya," he began, his voice low, "word of what you did has traveled far. The High Council has heard of the battle. They want you brought to the capital to speak of what happened here." She paused, the whetstone in her hand stilling as she lifted her gaze to his. The capital, she had trained for years in its shadow, never once called to stand within its halls. And now, because of one night, one desperate defense, she was summoned. Darius's eyes studied her carefully. "They will want to make you a hero. They will want your story, your face, your name. Are you ready for that?" Arya looked down at her spear, at the weapon that had been both her burden and her salvation. "I didn't fight to be a hero," she said quietly. "But if speaking helps them understand what strength really means, then I will go." The journey to the capital was long, the road winding through forests and across open plains. She traveled with a small escort, among them Kellen, who had insisted on accompanying her. Along the way, they passed villages where news of her stand at the gate had already spread. People greeted them with cheers, some even kneeling as she passed, their gratitude overwhelming in its intensity. Arya felt a strange unease beneath the admiration. She was not the savior they painted her to be, not the flawless warrior of their stories. She was simply someone who had refused to break, who had fought because she had no choice. Yet she carried their hopes on her shoulders now, hopes that grew heavier with every village, every cheer, every reverent glance. Kellen noticed the way her expression tightened, and one night by the campfire he said softly, "They see you as more than you see yourself. Don't be afraid of that. Symbols give people strength when their own feels small." Arya met his gaze, her eyes steady. "And who gives strength to the symbol when it falters?" He had no answer. When at last the capital's towering walls rose before them, Arya felt the weight of stone and history pressing down. The city was vast, its streets alive with merchants, nobles and guards. Yet even here, far from the eastern gate, whispers of her name spread like wildfire. Soldiers saluted as she passed, and children shouted her name in awe. She walked through it all with quiet composure, her armor plain, her spear strapped across her back. When they entered the great hall of the council, the air grew heavy with expectation. The counselors, draped in fine robes, studied her from their thrones. At the center, the high matron, stern and regal, leaned forward. "You are Arya, the defender of the eastern gate," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber. "Tell us how you stood where so many would have fallen." All eyes turned to her, waiting for words to match the legend already forming. Arya stepped forward, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. She bowed briefly, then straightened, her gaze steady. "I stood because I had no choice," she said simply. "The raiders came. The gate shook. Fear threatened to break us. I stood not because I am stronger than any other here, but because someone had to. I remembered the fear of being unprotected, of having no one to fight for me, and I swore I would not let that happen to others. That is all." Murmurs rippled through the hall, the counselors exchanging glances. Some seemed unsatisfied with her humility, others deeply moved. The high matron regarded her carefully, then spoke again. "And yet you did what no one else did. You turned fear into courage. You gave strength to those who had none. Whether you claim it or not, that is heroism." Arya shook her head slightly. "It was survival. If you want to honor me, then honor every soldier who stood beside me, every villager who endured. I did not win alone." Her words struck like a blade, cutting through the pomp and expectation of the chamber. The counselors, unaccustomed to such plain defiance, shifted uncomfortably, but the high matron's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Perhaps that is what we have needed to hear," she said. "Strength is not only in steel but in standing together. You will be remembered, Arya, not as combat weak, but as the one who taught us this truth." The declaration echoed through the hall, sealing her place not just in the memory of one battle, but in the heart of the realm itself. Yet as the council praised her, as nobles prepared to weave her story into song, Arya's thoughts drifted back to the eastern gate, to the dirt beneath her boots, to the comrades who had bled beside her. That was where her strength had lived, not in marble halls or gilded words, but in the fire of battle, in the choice to stand when standing seemed impossible. And she knew when the next test came she would make the same choice again. The sound of metal striking metal echoed in the night as Alina's blade met the heavy steel of the warlord's lieutenant. The campfires blazed around them, casting dancing shadows across the battlefield, but she felt no fear anymore. Her body moved on instinct, every swing, every block fueled by hours of training and by something far greater: her unwavering determination to protect the people behind her. Soldiers who had once mocked her now fought at her side, giving her space as she clashed with the most dangerous of the enemy. The lieutenant was massive, his strike strong enough to split shields in two, yet Alina met each blow with the same steadiness she had always carried in silence. Sweat dripped down her face, her muscles burned, but she refused to yield an inch. Behind her, the other defenders were holding, rallying under her example. She could hear their cries, not of fear this time, but of courage, of unity. She had lit a spark in them, and now the fire was spreading. Still, she knew this fight was far from over. The enemy had numbers, and their warlord had not yet entered the battle. If he did, the true storm would begin. The lieutenant grinned, pressing forward with crushing strikes, but Alina's calm eyes never wavered. She twisted aside, redirected his force, and with a swift counter sliced across his armor. He staggered, surprised, and for the first time the thought of defeat flickered in his expression. "Fall back," she shouted to her soldiers, signaling them to regroup. They obeyed without hesitation now, their respect for her absolute. The lieutenant roared in rage and charged, but Alina stood her ground. Her blade flashed once more, striking with precision, and the giant fell to his knees before collapsing in the dirt. Silence swept across the immediate field as enemy warriors hesitated, their most trusted commander lying broken before them. Alina raised her sword high, her voice carrying across the chaos. "This is our ground. No one takes it from us." The defenders roared in response, their spirits surging higher than ever. But the battle was not won. Out of the smoke, the warlord finally emerged. He was armored in black, towering and grim, with a great axe in his hands that had ended countless lives. His soldiers cheered his arrival, their fear of him overcoming their shock. Alina's men tensed, many looking uneasy again, but she stepped forward without hesitation. She knew this was the moment everything had been building toward. If she fell, so too would their courage. If she held firm even against this monstrous foe, then victory could still be seized. The warlord looked at her, amusement glinting in his eyes. "So, this is the fragile woman they said was too weak for war? Then why do I see you standing and my lieutenant dead at your feet?" His voice was cold, but Alina answered with fire. "Because strength is not in the size of your weapon or the fear you spread. Strength is in the will to stand when everyone else has fallen." With that, she raised her sword, challenging him directly. Gasps rippled through both armies. A lone woman standing against the most feared warlord in the land? It seemed impossible. Yet the way she held herself, unwavering and fierce, made it feel undeniable. The clash that followed was thunderous. His axe descended with brutal weight, shaking the earth, but Alina turned it aside, her body flowing like water around the storm. Again and again he struck, trying to crush her, but her blade flashed with speed, her movements sharp and precise. Sparks flew, dust swirled, and all around them both armies froze, watching the duel that would decide their fate. The warlord grew angrier, swinging harder, yet with every strike he missed, Alina grew stronger. She could feel her comrades' faith pouring into her, their cheers rising louder, their belief becoming a shield around her heart. The warlord's power was immense, and she knew a single mistake could end her life. But she remembered every word spoken against her, every sneer, every whisper calling her weak. Those memories did not break her, they forged her. She had carried them silently for years, and now they became fuel, fire in her veins that burned brighter than the warlord's fury. With a cry that shook the battlefield, she countered, driving her blade into his armor. He snarled in pain, stumbling back, disbelief flashing across his face. The sight of their mighty leader wounded sent a shudder through his men, and hope surged like lightning through Alina's. Still the fight was not finished. The warlord steadied himself, his eyes burning with rage. "You will not defeat me," he bellowed. But Alina only tightened her grip on her sword, planting her feet firmly in the ground. Her voice rang out, clear and unyielding. "I already have. Because you fight only for yourself. I fight for all of them." She pointed her blade toward her soldiers, toward the innocents behind them, toward everyone who needed her strength. For the first time, doubt flickered in the warlord's eyes. The battlefield had shifted. The once mocked woman now stood as a pillar holding the weight of everyone's hopes. Around her, hearts beat stronger, hands gripped weapons tighter, and voices rose in a chant of her name. Whether she fell or triumphed in the next clash no longer mattered. The people had seen the truth. She was no longer combat weak. She was the shield, the blade, the unshakable force standing against the storm. And with that truth alive in every soul around her, the warlord's shadow began to falter. The battlefield was shrouded in smoke and ash, the echoes of the earlier chaos still humming in the air. Elira stood with her blade lowered at her side, her body trembling not from fear, but from the weight of all that had transpired. Around her, soldiers began to stir, some groaning, some trying to rise despite their injuries. The once fractured unit was slowly coming alive again, their eyes all inevitably landing on the woman they had once dismissed as weak. None of them had words yet, but their silence was deafening in its recognition. She had stood alone when no one else could, and that fact could not be denied. Elira's chest heaved as she forced herself to breathe steadily, refusing to collapse though her strength waned. Her legs threatened to give out, but she kept them rooted to the earth, her hand firm around the hilt of her blade, the very image of unyielding defiance. General Kale was the first to step forward, his once pristine armor scorched and dented, his expression a storm of conflict. He had mocked her more than once, dismissed her value, even entertained the jokes about her supposed weakness. Now, his voice was stripped of all arrogance as he said quietly, You held them off alone. You saved us." It was not flattery, nor an attempt to repair his pride, it was a truth he could not ignore. Elira's gaze flickered to him, and though she did not speak, the steel in her eyes was answer enough. She had not defended them for recognition. She had done it because she could not allow herself to falter when so many lives depended on her will. Still, the murmurs spreading through the recovering soldiers grew louder, their tones tinged with awe and shame. She didn't run. She fought them all. One against dozens. The very same voices that had once laughed at her were now struggling to grasp what they had witnessed. Elira finally allowed her blade to sink into the ground, her hand pressing against the pommel as she leaned slightly for support. She could feel the sting of cuts across her arms and legs, the ache deep in her shoulders, and the slow trickle of blood from her temple where a blow had grazed her. Yet even wounded, she remained standing. The smoke cleared enough for the fallen enemy bodies to be seen in grim detail, scattered in heaps, their monstrous forms still and lifeless. The ground around her was carved with the marks of her battle, proof of the storm she had unleashed. Soldiers who had doubted her found themselves stepping back, not out of fear but out of reverence, as if she were something far greater than the title they had scorned her with. She was no longer combat weak. She was the shield that had held firm when everything else shattered. Kale knelt near one of the wounded men and began issuing orders for medics, but his eyes never strayed far from Elira. He had spent years leading, commanding, and shaping the fates of others, but in that single night he realized leadership was not merely about rank, it was about resolve, about sacrifice. And Elira had shown both more than anyone. As the camp began to repair itself, soldiers moved to assist her, offering water, offering to bandage her wounds, but she gently pushed them away. "See to the others first," she said softly, her voice hoarse from battle but carrying a quiet authority none dared question. Those who heard her obeyed without hesitation, another sign of how the tide had shifted. Later, as the fires dwindled and the wounded were stabilized, Kale approached her again, this time with none of the swagger he once carried. He stood before her as an equal, perhaps even a student before a teacher. "I judged you wrongly," he admitted, his tone low but firm. "We all did. And yet you carried the weight none of us could." Elira looked at him, her face smeared with dirt and blood, but her eyes unyielding as ever. "I carried it because it had to be carried," she answered. "Not because I wanted to prove anyone wrong." Those words cut deeper than any blade could. She had never fought to change their opinions. She had fought because lives depended on her. That was strength and they all finally saw it. Night deepened and the camp grew quieter, though unease lingered in the air. Everyone knew the battle was not over. The enemy would regroup and more trials lay ahead. But something had changed within the soldiers themselves. They no longer saw Elira as fragile or expendable. They saw her as the core around which their survival might pivot. Where before they had doubted her presence in their ranks, now they drew strength from it. She had become a living embodiment of defiance, her resilience igniting a spark that no taunt or mockery could extinguish. Around the fires, whispers spread, not of doubt but of admiration. Some even spoke of legends, wondering aloud if they had witnessed the birth of one that night. Elira retreated briefly to the edge of camp, finding a quiet place to sit beneath the fractured remnants of a broken wall. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind remained sharp, replaying every moment of the battle. The screams, the weight of countless strikes, the desperate stand, it all replayed vividly. For the first time though, she allowed herself a small breath of relief. She had not only survived, she had saved them. Yet, deep inside she felt a familiar heaviness. She knew the war was not won. This was but one night in a long and bloody struggle. And if she was to continue, she would need more than strength. She would need to forge trust, unity, and unshakable resolve among those around her. She could not fight every battle alone, no matter how strong she proved herself to be. As she sat in the shadows, her hand still resting on her blade, Cale's voice broke the silence again. He had followed her, though with hesitant steps. "The men will follow you now," he said. "Even me." Elira looked up, surprised by the admission, but his face bore no mockery this time, only sincerity. For the first time since she had joined their ranks, she felt something shifting, not just in how others saw her but in how the entire company might see themselves. Perhaps their survival would not rest on her strength alone. Perhaps, through her stand, she had reminded them all what it meant to endure. The final chapter of my story was perhaps the most beautiful one, because it wasn't just my victory, it was the victory of the entire neighborhood. When the day finally came and the court officially dissolved the HOA, it felt like chains that had bound us for years were suddenly broken. People breathed freely, like someone who had been locked in a dark room and suddenly stepped into the sunlight. The homes that were once littered with HOA warning notes and threats were now decorated with flowers, ribbons, and flags. Some people handed out sweets, some waved banners of freedom, and some simply stood there smiling with tears in their eyes. I stood at my doorway looking at the laughter and joy spreading like fire through the streets, and one thought echoed in my mind: we won. The women of the neighborhood, who had long lived under the constant shadow of the HOA's petty fines and warnings, finally came.